Hey there, guys. Welcome back to Prime in China, the ultimate destination for China based news and finance. But before we get started, as always, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell notification because we're dishing out fresh, mind blowing content every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Yep, that's right, 3 times a week to keep you informed and coming back for more.
No communist has ever harmed me, or even threatened to harm any of the people of any of the countries I've lived in, at least not yet.
So, of course, he says that communism never threatened him. What a horrible argument. You know, communism is of course, a political structure. It's never in itself threatened anyone directly. It's unable to. It's not something in the physical form. It is an idea, a way of running a government. But the issue with communism is that whenever you follow communism, whenever you believe communism and you put communism into place, certain things happen that are not good, that do threaten other people in other societies.
However, from some of the comments I get on social media, it's clear that some people really do hate communists. It's seen as the ultimate insult by some people to call me a commie, or even worse, a pinky.
I mean, just look at, the simple fact of how communism changes the way of China's political structure, the way that they think politically, and how they believe that they, for whatever reason, need to go and attack Taiwan and constantly threaten Taiwan. That's a situation of old, outdated communist thinking. And we realized this a very long time ago with communism, is that communism, of course, is not something that you want taking over the world. There are so many things that are limited under communist rule. You know what I mean? And we decided a long time ago that we don't want that. But he talks about this thing where you're born to hate communism. But is that really true? Are we born into a society that is...
There's no logical reason for this. It's purely because we in the West are told from the cradle to the grave that communists are evil. But they aren't.
is told to hate communism? Because here's the thing. Even if you're born into a society that's taking into account, that's making the bold statement that you have no way of learning. You know what I mean? The idea that people don't learn, the idea that people in the West don't have the ability to use media in an effort to come to their own conclusion is hilarious at best. Because we're told a lot of things, from a very young age. I, grew up around both of my parents being religious, but I'm not religious at all. That was my decision. You know what I mean? The idea that because you're born into a location or a group of people that forces them into a belief is just not true. The reason that people dislike communism is a lot better than just the simple fact that they're told to. We're told that McDonald's has America's favorite fries, but plenty of people are willing to stand out and have their own opinion. Okay? So that is just a horrible, horrible joke of saying that people only dislike communism because they were told to hate it. In fact, there's quite a few people that know and understand communism quite well that dislike it because they understand it quite well.
Let's be honest about North Korea. The North Korean communists never posed any threat to the USA, the UK, Australia, or any of the other 20 or so United Nations countries that went to war and carpet-bombed millions of civilians there. Neither did the Vietnamese communists pose any threat to the North American continent or the homelands of any of the other combatants that went there.
To say that as an example, he says that the North Koreans didn't threaten anyone. Communism has always been a threat to the rights of people. Communism has always been a threat to the freedom of speech. It's always been a threat for, freedom of travel. It's always been a threat for these types of things. They threatened back then and they continue to threaten today. The idea that, it's always these outside forces, because that's what he says. It's outside forces, not the evil governments.
Many people over the years, tens of millions in fact, have died in communist countries due to starvation, lack of medical care, or wars. But none of that is because their governments are evil. It's purely because outside forces want them to die.
And then he of course uses the horrible example that I hear all the time, which is Cuba. He says, well, America and the West just keep Cuba poor. Now, that's a terrible example, and it's a very, very bold statement to make.
There are very few rich people in North Korea or Cuba, but that's not because the government stops them getting rich. It's because the so-called international community refuses to do business with them.
Because it shows just how little that people know and understand about that type of situation that aren't from here. So I will tell you now, I live in the state of Florida. The amount of Cuban people here in this state is astronomical. It's incredible how many Cuban people there are here, and none of them support their government. None of them. And he makes this claim that they're all fleeing, because they're criminals, and that they're fleeing because they were in poverty. You are exactly right. These people were living in poverty, and that is why they left. But the cause of their poverty in their country is not because of the rest of the world. He, of course, makes this huge thing about, Cuba and, the trade embargo. They always bring this up. The Cuban trade embargo.
Address that, because the fundamental question being put to us is, so the people of Cuba are suffering. The people of Cuba are going through a difficult economic time. I would argue that they've done so for 62 years. Why don't we get rid of the embargo? It would make life easier for them. And I want to address it. I want to address it especially to those that are not as familiar with this issue. First of all, let me begin by saying there are no American ships blockading Cuba, surrounding the island of Cuba. In fact, Cuba, frankly, does not have an embargo in the way people think. Cuba trades with the whole world. For example, Cuba every year exports $1.2 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot for an island of 11 million people, okay? They export $461 million to China, $127 million to Spain, $65 million to the Netherlands, $64 million to Germany. This is not a country that's isolated. They trade with every country in the world. They export $5.3 billion a year. With Spain alone, they import $1 billion from Spain. Another $790 million from China, $327 million from Italy, $285 million from Canada and from Russia. So they import over $5 billion, they export over $1.2 billion. Cuba is not isolated. They trade with every country. This regime trades with virtually every country on the planet. You know who else they trade with? The United States of America. Cuba trades with the United States of America. They import almost $280 million a year, almost as much as they do with Canada and Russia.
And even though that's really a discussion of Cuba and not China, I'll touch on it a bit here just because of my personal experience of talking to Cuban people and understanding this subject. There's no embargo with Cuba. Cuba is getting plenty of trade. There are plenty of countries that go out of their way to trade with Cuba. How do we know this? Have you ever actually looked into Cuba very much? Or are you just assuming that you know? Cuba has been a major travel destination for many years. Beautiful beaches, okay?
In today's video, we'll be looking at the all-exclusive resorts located in the largest single island of the northern of the Caribbean Sea, Cuba. From pearly white beaches to pink flamingos, you can definitely count on this promising region to offer top-notch exclusive resorts that will leave you in awe of its beauty.
Let me ask you, who do you think owns all of those resorts that are there in Cuba? Okay, a large percentage of Cuba's GDP overall comes from the resorts that are on their land. I'm going to tell you, it's a country very close to America. It's called Canada. If there's really a trade embargo, no one can trade with Cuba, and it's all because everyone just hates communism, how come the main company that owns all these resorts in Cuba is Canadian? The reason for that is quite simple. Cuba didn't build these resorts. They didn't create all the products at these resorts. A Canadian company paid for this stuff and shares the profit with none other than the Cuban government. So when you tell me that no one trades with Cuba and that it's the embargo, you're wrong. Go and look online. There are plenty of countries that trade with Cuba. Again, the resorts that are there are built by a Canadian company.
People in communist countries are not poor because of communism. China has proven that. They are poor because capitalists have the power to keep them that way. And it's not just the USA, but really it's as simple as saying that. The US want countries to be like them. The alternative to a communist country changing ideology to become like them is to stay poor and die early. Sanctions, embargoes, trade restrictions, and the defense of national security, these all cause people to live in poverty in places such as oil-rich Venezuela or Iran.
But even with their guns, state security forces are being pushed back, with protesters fighting them off like never seen before. The demonstrations were triggered by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Just over a week ago, she was arrested by Iran's notorious morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf too loosely and died in their custody. Since then, women have taken to the streets in fury, ripping off their coverings, which are compulsory under Iranian law, with some setting them on fire.
And they're put in place for one reason only, and that's to cause the deliberately impoverished people of the region to revolt against the conditions they, in their lack of education and as a result of massive Western propaganda, often assume are caused by their own government.